Welcome to the S.O.A.P video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. This is the last of 4 weeks, 4 sessions that we are working through a set of 5 minor prophets, right? It's sort of 4 plus 1, and we'll talk about that. But we've done Micah and Nahum. And then last time we did
Zephaniah. We did part of Zephaniah, but we also did Habakkuk.
Habakkuk for 3 chapters, and we started Zephaniah. So this time we'll finish Zephaniah, and then we will do Malachi at the end. And I think what this does, and we sort of jump around with our, with our S.O.A.P videos, but what this does is you can look back at our S.O.A.P videos, and you'll find all the minor prophets. This brings us to the end, I think, of the ones that we needed to do.
Nice. So like you said, we started this last week, a 3-chapter book, and Habakkuk is kind of cool because it's a conversation with God, and he actually questions God. God, what are we doing here? It's not that he doesn't trust God, but there's some verification going on, and there's some questions, and God is absolutely fine with that. And he gives a good answer, and Habakkuk gives a good response that we'll see. All right, so we also covered 2 chapters with Zephaniah. And Zephaniah prophesizes about the day of the Lord. And this is a great and terrible day, and we saw both sides of it, where Jesus is coming back to earth as a Messiah. He's going to be the king, and he's the warrior king. And really the first 2 chapters are hard to read because that's the terrible part.
And we're talking about, like, still future to us. We're talking about the second coming. So we're in the church age now. There's the rapture of the church, where the church goes to heaven. Then there's 7 years of tribulation, where God purifies Israel and punishes Gentile nations. And then Jesus comes back to establish his kingdom. But that's when he finally defeats his enemies. And that's sort of the culmination of what we're seeing in chapters 1 and 2.
And that's why it's called the day of the Lord, too, the day that God is coming back. Jesus
so there's a period, but
So those chapters are a little hard to read, but that's okay. And it also sets us up for the next chapter, chapter 3. So God explains his actions against Jerusalem, right? And the whole idea, and we've actually heard this all the time.
Many times, right?
Jerusalem's corrupt, and God is pouring out his judgment against all. And we see that, and again, that's part of the terrible side. But then around verse 11 in chapter 3, it shifts. And God shifts all the bad things that are going to happen to, here are the reasons why it's a great day. And it is a matter of perspective, too, and where you're looking at. So God says, I will remove those who proudly boast, and no one will ever be arrogant again on my holy hill. He is taking ownership.
Well, and that holy hill is Jerusalem, right? Because now he's shifting from the tribulation, from the second coming, and all of that
into
judgment
what's
and
going
wrath.
To happen. Here's where we're going to be going forward.
Into the kingdom and the millennium.
Where Jesus is leading from Jerusalem. The people will remain humble and meek and find safety in the Lord. They will not lie, will not be deceitful. 2 huge things that he has a problem with. Also, he says, be happy. The judgment is done. You knew this judgment was coming. Now it's over. You no longer need to fear for disaster. And then he said, how good is it that you have a God with you that can protect you, a God that can be a warrior. And it's like,
so that is,
I get all this.
So that's the Davidic covenant. That's the Davidic kingdom where he is protecting the people. They will never be oppressed by any other nation ever again. So physical protection. So they will have their land back. So that's the land covenant that God made with them. And then they will also be able to worship him. And that's the new covenant that they're going to worship.
That takes off everything,
That takes off everything. All of those promises that God has made to Israel will finally be fulfilled in the millennium, and this sort of wraps up some of that, or sort of something not wraps up some of it, but sort of summarizes all of those.
How it's going to be wrapped up. Cool. All right, so that ends that book.
That ends Zephaniah.
So let's start a new one.
Hey, so I can't go directly to the next page like we did from Habakkuk to Zephaniah last week. We have to push forward a little bit here. And in these few pages, we are going to fast forward about 200 years.
200 years.
200
okay.
years to go to the book of Malachi.
Yeah, so we're going to the book of Malachi. So historically, this is the last Old Testament book,
Yes.
right, that was written. So when we get to the end of Malachi, I know we get the maps and, and all that, but what's the next thing that happens in the Bible?
Well, so between let me back up a little bit. Between Zephaniah, where we just were, and Malachi, we have the end of
Just a couple things.
Yeah, we have the end of Jeremiah, we have Daniel, we have Ezekiel, we have Ezra, we have Esther,
Right.
and then we start Nehemiah. And it's during Nehemiah. Nehemiah was one of the governors after the Babylonian exile, after Persia, after everything. They finally come back to their land. Then we have Haggai, we have Zechariah,
Rebuilding of the walls and
all of that stuff
getting it started back up.
before Malachi shows up. So now you have Nehemiah, and Nehemiah becomes governor. And he's governor for a little bit in Jerusalem. Then he goes back to Persia, actually, and does a stint back there. Then he comes back to be governor again. And it's during that last time that we have Malachi as the last speaking prophet before a 400-year period of silence. After Malachi, before we get to Luke, really. I know we usually say Matthew is the first book of the New Testament and the birth of Jesus, but we have John the Baptist has to come before Jesus, right? So that's really Luke 1.
Okay.
So 200 years from Zephaniah to Malachi, and then 400 years. And there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament, but then nothing between Malachi and the New Testament. It's called the period of silence, or the intertestamental period of about 400 years.
Okay, so Malachi chapter 1, God asks Israel, look, or he says, I've shown you love, but you ask, how have you shown love to us?
Yeah.
And he says, I chose Jacob and rejected Esau.
Yeah.
So this is like a love-hate thing.
So
right?
some translations, so a couple of things here. Malachi, one of the patterns in Malachi is God makes a statement, this I've done, and Israel responds with, well, how have you done that, right? And then he has to explain, this is what it is. So some translations will say, Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated, right? Our translation, we're using the net here. I think it's a better translation because yes, even though it says love and hate, it's not that God hated people or whatever. It's a matter of choice, right? In the context, how have you loved us? Well, I chose you, right? I chose you. What did God choose Israel? He chose them to show the world of God, about God. He chose them to bring Messiah into the world, bring Jesus into the world, the Savior. So he chose them, and in choosing them, that context is, I loved you in this way. I chose you to do this. I didn't choose Esau. Right. Now, Paul is actually going to quote this in Romans chapter 9 when he says, did God have any right to choose one nation over another? Well, yeah, he absolutely did have a right to choose one nation over another. And he quotes Malachi 1 to make that point.
Okay. Also, there's another term in here that gets used a lot, the Lord of Heaven's armies.
Yeah. Yeah, traditionally translated Lord of Hosts, but Heaven's Armies actually sort of helps us visualize it because the Lord of Hosts is the commander of the angelic armies of heaven, which is a battle term. It's a warrior term. So when God says, I'm speaking this as the Lord of Heaven's armies, Israel sort of needs to be on the defensive or on the other side because they're like, that's a military term. He's coming at us with some strength.
Right.
So there's a little bit of a opposition tone to this whole book.
Yeah. Well, he has a problem.
Well,
right?
and they're like, well, what do you mean you've done this? You've done what for us? It's like, seriously?
So God says to the priests, where's my honor? And, you make light of my name. There's improper sacrifices. You're treating the table of the Lord, which is the altar.
Yeah.
You're treating it way too lightly. You're allowing, like, there's no importance.
Yeah.
You're allowing sick animals on there to be sacrificed.
Well, yeah, that was part of the thing under the law, right?
There needs to be an unblemished animal.
Unblemished animals, perfect, no problem, and they're bringing just anything they want.
How about this one?
Yeah.
Because I want to keep the best for me. And that is the problem, right? Yeah. So God interprets that as stealing from the people, and he's definitely blaming the priests because they're allowing it to happen.
Oh, I love this. He's like, you don't think that's wrong? Try offering that to your governor. He says, if you wouldn't even accept it, why should I accept this stuff?
Right. And he says there's going to be a harsh commendation for this because God is a great king. And remember, like you said, 200 years since they actually got taken out of a nation because of this kind of stuff.
They've been
And
exiled.
now they're right back at it again.
It's like, come on. Now, the one thing I will give them this, the one thing that sort of kicked them over the edge, that God exiled them, was idolatry. Ever since they came back, they never really turned back to idolatry. Yeah. They didn't obey well, right? You know, and there's Roman oppression and Greek oppression and all these, but they never turned to idolatry like you see some of the earlier prophets accusing
where
them
everyone was. You allow the high places, you allow people to.
To that never came back.
Okay, in chapter 2, God says, again to the priests, this is serious. You need to take it serious. You need to honor my name. And that the people, or the priests, had taught people incorrectly. And actually caused many to violate the law. And if you think about that, you can see a priest doing that, right? A wrong interpretation. Now I cause you to sin when you really don't know any better. Right? Because the priest is telling you.
The priests were arbitrators of the law. And so people were just, you're not going to memorize the 600 some laws. You have to. That's what the priests were supposed to help do, and the people just were clueless. Right.
So that was the first thing. Second, he said he would reverse the blessings that he promised for Israel, and they would actually become curses. Until the priests changed.
And that goes all the way back to the book of Deuteronomy. If you obey me, this is what I will do. If you disobey me, this is what I will do.
And they keep picking from the B list. And third, God actually was withholding blessings because, in this case, people were divorcing for reasons not allowed by God.
God had given, under the Mosaic law, he said, if you're going to divorce your wife, these are the things that were allowed. Same thing is true in the New Testament. And they were just doing anything they wanted. And he said, you're being unfaithful to your wife by not treating her properly. And it's really interesting. Peter picks up either on this or it says something similar in 1 Peter 3 when he says to husbands, he's like, if you don't treat your wives properly, God's not even going to listen to your prayers, which is really interesting that this is not an Old Testament, New Testament thing. This is how husbands and wives are supposed to be.
All right. In chapter 3, God says he's about to send a messenger. And of course, our first thought is, in 400 years after this is written, Jesus. So it's got to be Jesus coming as a baby. But then God seems to be talking about Jesus when he's coming as a Messiah. So we're actually jumping over Jesus being here to his second coming.
Yeah, sort of, because Mark quotes this passage here, I'm about to send my messenger who will clear the way before me. And Mark quotes that in reference to John the Baptist. And we'll see the same thing in chapter 4, where John the Baptist was sent before Jesus, but the people didn't accept Jesus. And so, yes, you're right. There's going to be another one
messenger
in the future. Yeah.
Is this the only place where we get that? Is there any in the New Testament? Oh, you said Mark says
Mark
it too.
points that there is in Isaiah. There's another one that's quoted both in Matthew and Mark that refers to John the Baptist. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, right.
Yep.
And of course, Jesus will come to judge people because of all the bad things that show up. And I really like it because there's a list in here, right? Witchcraft, divination, adultery, promise breakers. And then he encapsulates it into one phrase, and he says, it shows that they don't fear God.
Yeah. Yep.
I like that. And God says, you're lucky. You're lucky I don't go back on my promises.
Right.
Otherwise, Jacob, which would also, be Israel, or the split kingdom, would be dead.
Yeah, the whole nation, not the kingdoms anymore, because after the exile, they came back, and we don't really have these two kingdoms anymore. Now we're back to a unified nation.
Right, but he's saying the whole nation is robbing God. And then God says, look, test me. Yep. I think you should test me. All of Israel should bring their tithe and put it in the storeroom.
Yep.
See what I do.
Yeah.
I'll give you so much, and he lists what will happen.
Yeah.
He says, open the window to heaven and pour out blessings until there's no room.
Now, this passage gets misused all the time, all over the place. Oh, see, we're supposed to tithe and all this stuff. And I love the way you say it, the way you said it, is that the tithe was the nation of Israel was supposed to bring their tithe. Because the tithe was basically a tax. Under the Mosaic law, multiple times a year, every time they had a new harvest, every time they had the ranchers had new births in their flocks, they were tithed. They were supposed to bring this tithe, this tax, to the storehouse. Why? Because the Levites
Right.
were not farmers and ranchers.
Right.
They were ministers. And so this was how God set up for the Levites to be taken care of. The other tribes would take care of them. Right. This does not have, there are some similar things in the church, but this is not a command for the church. There's not a direct application for the church. God does not promise anyone to open the doors of heaven and pour out blessings if you bring your tithe to church. I'm not saying you shouldn't bring money to church. I'm just saying it's not a command, and you can't use Malachi 3 to prove it.
But at this time, for the nation of Israel, right, there are these blessings.
Because they're still under the Mosaic law and the Mosaic covenant.
Well, and he also says that he would stop the plague that is killing the crops.
Yep.
And then I love this last one. He says, and if this happens, all the nations would call you blessed.
Yeah.
And I think that's so cool because these blessings would only happen in Israel.
Yes.
These blessings would showcase Israel, and all the nations would be going, we don't have this.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Which was the whole point of the Mosaic law and the Mosaic covenant to begin with, and they never got it right. And even after Malachi, they didn't get it right.
Yeah. But the people say, it's useless serving God.
Yeah.
And if we look around, all we see is arrogant people who succeed, and those who practice evil succeed.
Yep.
And again, this is thousands of years ago, not yesterday.
I was going to say, this
nothing
can
has
write
changed.
itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know what? You go back into the Psalms, and David says the same thing, and everybody
Yeah.
said the same thing. What the Proverbs? What's the point in serving God? Because evil people succeed, and godly people seem to not succeed.
Yeah. So some people around the time of Malachi, this got out. And whether Malachi taught it or however it got out, and some people who were like-minded got together and said, this is a problem. We need to reaffirm to God that it's not the whole nation.
Yeah.
So they actually reaffirmed the covenant and signed a document.
Yeah.
Where they took it to be, we are going to do this.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yes. But so the big thing is, did it have an effect?
Well, I mean, it didn't change.
Yes, it did.
Yeah, it didn't change the whole nation, but it's always good.
But the Lord took notice of it.
Yeah, this is where. So it was during the exile that we come across for the first time, just before the exile in Isaiah, we come across the term remnant, because in every generation there was a small group who did try to obey, who did try to follow so this would be the remnant. Today, the remnant would be those Jews who have placed their faith in Jesus as Savior. So they're part of the church as well, but they are the remnant, the believing remnant of Israel. We'll see the same thing after the rapture and the tribulation. There will be a part of believing Jews. There's always been a remnant. Even if the entire nation was off doing its thing against God, there's always been a group, a remnant, believing.
Well, like you said, that's part of why he also kept the nation.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, then we get into chapter 4, and it again talks about the day of the Lord. We talked about that. He refers to it as a furnace, right?
Yes.
And evildoers will be like chaff. So that part of the wheat that has no benefit at all and just gets used as fuel for the fire.
Yep.
It doesn't going to leave anything behind. But he says, if you respect my name, you will be saved.
Yeah. Fun fact, that verse right there, chapter 4, verse 2, shows up in one of our Christmas songs that people just come, it's not the first verse.
Must be singing it.
But you have to hum, risen with healing in his wings. Now you have to figure out which one it is, but it'll come to you. Risen with healing in his wings. That's actually not talking about Christmas. Ultimately, that's talking about his second coming, when he finally vindicates everything, when he finally brings justice to Israel and sets up his kingdom. It's a kingdom passage. It's not a Christmas passage, but it is in one of your favorite Christmas songs.
Does it bring joy to everyone?
Nope, not that.
Taking it. I thought I had.
Nope, not that.
All right. So at the end of chapter 4, we're promised Elijah. Mm-hmm. Right. So maybe not the Elijah, but an Elijah-like person.
Yep.
But,
I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord arrives.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a messenger coming.
Yeah. Fun fact: in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus said, "If you, nation of Israel, would have accepted it, John the Baptist would have been Elijah." Which means it tells us two things. First of all, it tells us that that Jesus' intention was to fulfill all of this and be able to bring in the kingdom. So the tribulation would have started, and he would have come back and brought in the kingdom, and John would have fulfilled this prophecy of Elijah.
Right.
The second thing that tells us is that it does not require a reincarnation or a resurrection of Elijah the prophet. It doesn't have to be a resurrection of Elijah. It's not, but there's this concept of the power and the spirit of Elijah that does show up, which means that John didn't fulfill it because Israel did not accept him, so it still has to come in the future. But that means that Elijah does not have to be maybe one of those two witnesses or those prophets or whatever, like some people think.
Could be,
it has
but
to be
doesn't.
Elijah.
Yeah.
Well, not if John could fulfill it.
Yeah.
It could be any prophet in the future.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Good. And that takes us to the end of minor prophets.
And brings us to the end, not just of the minor prophets,
Wow.
but the Old Testament as well.
Nice.
So, because the next page is the New Testament, but then, there's 400 years on this blank page here.
Yeah,
That this page intentionally left blank. 400
times.
years from Malachi to really John the Baptist and Jesus.
Yeah, nice. All right.
So,
Well, little series.
Yeah, I hope you found this part of our SOAP reading really interesting. Some books that you probably don't spend a lot of time in, and making some of these connections and putting them where they go in the timeline is always helpful, and we appreciate it when you tell us that. So send us your questions and your comments and some of the things that you learned, some of your takeaways, and share and subscribe with your friends and family and tell them to do the same thing. We will be back with a brand new book next time, a brand new series. Woohoo! Gary always likes starting a new one, and we'll see what that is next time.
Bye.